Hello, welcome to week 5 of our course. And this week we will be focusing on the First World War and the Second World War, both of which took place in the first half of the 20th century, or 1900s. You have 3 assignments to complete for this week. First, you are asked to participate in a discussion board. The discussion question asks you to consider whether the First and Second World War can accurately be viewed as a single long conflict. The second assignment for this week is to read articles discussing the Holocaust. The Holocaust took place during World War II. During the Holocaust, more than 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany, and 4 million non-Jews were also murdered within the Holocaust. You'll read debates about what could motivate people to participate in the Holocaust. Why did people carry out these mass murders? There are differing perspectives on this issue, and you're asked to write a commentary based on the articles that you read. And finally, you're asked to view a film, Pride of Our Nation, which deals with a portion of the Second World War, particularly the Allied invasion of Normandy, France on D-Day in 1944. It also touches upon aspects of the war in the Pacific. So unfortunately, the topic for this week is rather grim: 2 world wars and genocide. But these are certainly very important aspects of contemporary world history that we should remember and understand. The First World War took place from 1914 to 1918. In this war, Germany fought against Britain, France, and Russia. Later, the United States entered the war against Germany as well. Germany was ultimately defeated in the First World War, but after terrible destruction was unleashed on the continent of Europe. An entire generation of young men died in Europe during the First World War, died or were maimed. There were very few young men who were not scarred by the war. People referred to the generation of the First World War as the lost generation. The death toll in the First World War was truly staggering. Just to give a few examples, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, near the Somme River in France, 35,000 British soldiers were killed. To put that in some perspective, in 10 years in the recent war in Iraq, approximately 5,000 Americans died. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme during the First World War, 35,000 British soldiers were killed. And the Battle of Verdun, which lasted for 10 months near the town of Verdun in France, approximately 750,000 men were killed or wounded on both sides, the French side and the German side of the battle. So in total you had 1.5 million casualties in a single battle in the war. And in this battle, neither side gained a single yard of ground. The 2 sides were in exactly the same position when the battle ended as when it began. So the First World War was truly a senseless slaughter. It dragged on for 4 years, and armies on each side launched hopeless attacks on entrenched fortified positions and were massacred, were cut down by machine gun and artillery fire. Another important aspect of the First World War was it was the first truly mechanized war in Europe, where the means of mass killing had been mechanized by the products of the Industrial Revolution, the machine gun being perhaps the best example of this. Entire nations were devastated by the war. The First World War was spoken of as the war to end all wars. The goal of the United States in entering the war was to bring about a sustained era of peace. Unfortunately, that would not occur. At the end of the First World War, a peace treaty known as the Treaty of Versailles was put into effect. Since Germany was defeated in the war, Germany was stripped of approximately 15% of its territory. Germany had to pay back billions of dollars of reparations for the damages caused by the war. And Germany faced a number of other punitive provisions. Unfortunately, these provisions helped to stir animosity in Germany. Many people in Germany resented the harsh terms of the peace treaty, and this discontent would in part give rise to the Second World War. All of Europe and really all of the world plunged into a great economic depression in 1929, which continued until 1939. The economies of the world were devastated, millions of people were unemployed. This also contributed to the outbreak of the Second World War. In 1933, a radical political movement known as the Nazi Party, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party, gained power in Germany. And the Nazi Party immediately launched a campaign to rebuild Germany's military, in spite of the fact that this violated the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1939, Germany launched a massive invasion of its neighbors. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, quickly conquering approximately half of Poland. The Soviet Union conquered the other half of Poland. The Soviet Union was ruled by a communist dictatorship, led by a brutal dictator known as Joseph Stalin. Nazi Germany was led by a brutal dictator, Adolf Hitler. Subsequently, Nazi Germany would invade and conquer France, would invade and conquer basically all of North Africa, with the exception of Egypt and the Suez Canal. Nazi Germany would then invade the Soviet Union, conquering a huge swath of territory in what today would be Russia. Germany would also invade the Scandinavian states, such as Norway, and bring about great devastation on an unbelievable scale to the European continent. One of the more horrific aspects, the most horrific aspect of the Nazi regime was a campaign of genocide known as the Holocaust. The Nazis were moved or motivated by and embraced an ideology of extreme racism. The Nazi Party asserted that Germans were part of a superior race known as the Aryan race. This was an entirely fictive racial group, but this was the belief system that the Nazis promoted. The Nazis argued that all non-Aryans were subhuman and should be either enslaved or murdered, essentially. So the Nazis began a campaign of mass murder, really at the same time that the war began. When German forces invaded Poland, following the German army was a group known as the SS. The SS began as Hitler's personal bodyguard, but they soon became a much more extensive force. The SS would go from town to town and would round up people that they considered undesirable, predominantly Jews, and would march them at gunpoint out into the rural countryside, force them to dig large pits in the ground, and then execute these people and dump their bodies into these mass graves. The SS executed approximately 1.5 million people in Poland. These were men, women, children, old people, people who had no ability to defend themselves, oftentimes. The Nazis then built what were known as death camps in Poland. These were camps or prisons that were used to kill huge numbers of people, the most famous of which was Auschwitz in Poland. Rail lines were built leading up to the prison camps, and people all across Europe were sent to these death camps. The largest group who was sent to the death camps were Jews. The Roma or Gypsies were also sent to death camps. Homosexuals were sent to death camps. Common criminals were sent to the death camps, as were in some cases Soviet prisoners of war. When people arrived by train at these camps, Nazi doctors would quickly sort them into two groups. Those were considered able to work, young men, young women in reasonably good health, were sent to one side. Those who were considered unfit to work, older people, young children, and the mothers of young children, were sent to the other side. Those considered unfit to work were immediately sent to gas chambers, where they were killed by an industrial insecticide known as Zyklon B, and then their bodies were burned in furnaces. Those that were chosen to work faced harsh labor conditions within the camps, inadequate food, and gradual starvation. When they became too weak to work anymore, they too were sent to the gas chambers and to the furnaces, to the crematoria. Ultimately, approximately 10 to 11 million people were killed in the Holocaust. Approximately 6 million were killed based on the fact that they were Jews, and the Nazis had extreme hatred for the Jewish people. Others who were killed included, as I mentioned, the Roma, Gypsies, homosexuals. The Nazis also killed people suffering from disabilities within their own country, for example. This was actually one of the first groups that the Nazis killed. The Nazis referred to people with disabilities as quote-unquote useless eaters. And so individuals in nursing homes who couldn't take care of themselves were killed, were injected with poisons. Individuals who suffered from severe physical or mental disabilities, who resided in hospitals or asylums, were killed by the Nazis. Even German soldiers who were severely wounded would be executed by the German government. So it was quite a horrific regime, to say the least. Fortunately, the Nazis were defeated ultimately by a combination of the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and a variety of other allied nations. Unfortunately, the war was truly devastating to humanity, even more devastating than the First World War. In the Soviet Union alone, 20 million people died. 400,000 American soldiers were killed in the conflict. Entire European cities were bombed into oblivion. Cities in Germany, like Berlin, were reduced to rubble through aerial bombardment from the British and American air forces. On a single night in Dresden, and a single bombing campaign in one night, 50,000 people were burned to death, were killed. So it's a truly horrific war. In Asia, an equally horrific war took place. The Empire of Japan sought to conquer China. The United States, in response, ultimately refused to sell any oil to Japan. And in response to this, the Japanese Empire attacked the United States, bombing the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. This drew the United States into a protracted war in Asia and the Pacific. It was a very brutal war. The Japanese often tortured and killed individuals that they took prisoner. And ultimately, Japan would be devastated by this war. the United States would launch a massive aerial bombardment campaign of Japan, which ended with the dropping of 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender. World War II is the most terrible war in human history in terms of the sheer scale of loss of life, and tragically many of those who died were civilian non-combatants, who were often intentionally killed. I look forward to working with you during this week. I hope that you will learn a great deal during this unit. Thank you.